Good evening. Tonight, we begin with something as familiar as the pillow beneath your head, and yet far stranger than you might expect: sleep, or rather, how people slept in the Middle Ages. Before you get too comfortable, take a moment to gently support the channel by liking and subscribing, but only if you truly enjoy this kind of storytelling. And in the comments, share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a wonder to see who's tuning in from across the world, connected through one quiet thing: we all need rest. Now, dim the lights, let the fan hum softly in the background, and allow yourself to ease into tonight's journey. Before there were electric bulbs or glowing screens, before TikTok scrolls or advice on sleep hygiene, nighttime in the medieval world came with a rhythm that would bewilder even the most disciplined modern melatonin enthusiast. It was called segmented sleep, a natural two-part sleep cycle, divided almost perfectly in half, like a dry medieval biscuit snapped down the center. The nightly pattern was simple. As dusk arrived and the sky turned ink dark, most people nothing interrupts a medieval REM cycle quite like worrying whether your goat has escaped into the darkness. And yes, this window of time was also considered ideal for intimacy. Medieval physicians and old marriage manuals described it as the best time for closeness, when the body was rested and the mind quiet. In other words, too relaxed to argue. So if you've ever thought yourself romantic for waking early to make your partner coffee, know that your medieval ancestors were already setting the bar. Somewhere between fire tending and goat checking. Strangely, modern science now suggests that segmented sleep might actually be more natural for humans. It turns out that without artificial light, our circadian rhythms align quite well with this two-phase pattern. So the next time you find yourself wide awake at 2 a.m. staring into the darkness, don't panic. Just smile softly and whisper to yourself, "Ah yes, the watch has begun," and maybe symbolically tend your own fire. This gentle dance of two sleeps lasted until the industrial gel. Back then, your average bed was a far cry from comfort. In fact, It was often just a pile of things that used to be alive, now flattened under the weight of poor sleep and forgotten dreams. A typical peasant's bed consisted of a straw-filled mattress known as a pallet, literally just hay or straw stuffed into a sack of coarse fabric, if they were lucky. That is, if not, the straw simply lay on the cold floor, possibly damp, possibly already claimed by a wandering cat. These beds were not soft. They were not Most people slept in the clothes they'd worn all day. Pajamas didn't really exist, and neither did personal space. Entire families, parents, children, perhaps a grandparent or two, all shared the same sleeping space. Sometimes the same pile of straw. If you got too warm, you simply rolled over into someone's elbow and tried not to complain. Of course, the nobles lived differently. Their beds had wooden frames, feather-stuffed mattresses, embroidered sheets, and elegant canopies to keep out the drafts and, hopefully, the lice. These beds were so valuable, they were passed down through generations. You didn't inherit land. You inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy feather bed. Still, for most people, the bed wasn't a sanctuary. It wasn't a retreat. It was a place to not freeze, to avoid the chickens, and if you were lucky, to dream of one day sleeping on something that didn't rustle, bite, or squawk. Not everyone in the Middle Ages had the luxury of soft linens or cozy blankets. In fact, if you were fortunate enough to inherit your Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy feather bed, that was considered a stroke of luck. For most people, the bed wasn't a haven of comfort. It was simply a place to avoid freezing, a space to dodge the chickens wandering indoors, a place to lay your head and perhaps, just perhaps, dream of a future where your mattress didn't rustle, peck, or squeak. And when we hear the word nightcap today, we think of a cozy drink, perhaps something warm and strong, sipped beside a fireplace while the world slows down. But in the medieval world, a nightcap was not a drink, it was a hat. A real fabric hat, usually long, often floppy, and frequently ridiculous looking. But essential. Medieval homes weren't known for insulation. Stone walls, thatched roofs, and windows made of thin horn or oiled parchment did little to stop the cold. Central heating, that was cold. A dog curled at your feet under the blankets thought to stay warm. People covered their heads at night, especially since heat escapes fastest through the scalp. The nightcap, made from wool or scraps of linen, became a nighttime necessity. For men, it was practical. For women, it often served as a coif, doubling as modesty and warmth, especially when hair was washing hadn't happened since last Lent, and these caps weren't just functional. In some communities, a woman's head had to be covered at all times, even in sleep. Nightcaps were sometimes embroidered, dyed, or decorated to signal wealth or family status, a miniature flag of prosperity perched on your forehead. In the cities, if someone answered the door wearing their nightcap, it was the medieval equivalent of saying, "I'm off duty. Please go away." These caps were usually paired with long, loose nightshirts. Imagine Ebenezer Scrooge's sleepwear menace, the ghosts and regret. Not fashionable, certainly not flattering, but practical, sometimes itchy, occasionally flammable, and yet sleep wasn't always a private affair. Imagine you're a weary traveler merchant, a pilgrim, or someone whose mule gave up halfway to Norwich. You stumble into an inn and request a place to sleep. But instead of a room, a bed, or even your own corner, you're assigned space in a bed with strangers. In beds were shared 2, 3, sometimes 4 people squeezed together beneath one threadbare cover. Privacy was a luxury no one expected. In fact, beds functioned more like communal platforms, a rotating cast of snorers, mutterers, and the occasional boil-covered wanderer. In larger towns, you might find a hall of beds arranged like bunks, filled with elbows and dreams. Some inns grouped guests by trade blacksmiths, monks with monks, thieves with thieves, supposedly, but often it was simply first come, first sprawled. Of course, this sounds like a nightmare to modern sensibilities, but to them, it was a step up from sleeping in a ditch with the rain, the rats, and the risk of rebellion. Travelers wary of theft would tie their purse to their belt or sleep on their bags, turning luggage into both pillow and alarm. If your bundle moved, you woke up poorer. The wealthy didn't share. Nobles traveled with their own bedding, entourages, or demanded private rooms, and innkeepers complied if they valued their roof. But even the rich couldn't escape the medieval ritual of nighttime fear. For them, going to bed wasn't just a pause in the day, was a preparation for death. Each night, they faced the real possibility they might not wake. Illness, fire, thieves, or simply the unkind arithmetic of aging in the year 1247. Any could claim them in their sleep, so before the candles were snuffed, before the dog curled tight, people prayed, not for relaxation, but for salvation. Prayers were whispered like legal agreements. If I should die before I wake, I pray thee, Lord, my soul to take. Children were taught to murmur them, not only for their souls, but to keep them quiet, and come especially when the family dog had claimed their blanket again. Parents warned them gently, angels are watching, comforting. Perhaps, until you realize the angels functioned more like celestial security cameras. Adults had entire prayer catalogs for guilt, for safety, for plague prevention. Those prayers aged poorly. Some called on saints believed to guard sleepers, a kind of divine bouncer, standing watch at the dream world's gate in monasteries and noble estates. The night ended with Complant, the final sacred office of the day. Afterward came silence. not just out of piety, but because everyone was cold, hungry, and afraid of the dark. In the end, prayers weren't soothing, they were insurance. Ancient antivirus software whispered to the stars, just in case, because sleep in the medieval mind was never just sleep. It was a quiet gamble between the body, the soul, and the night. Dreams, animals, and monastic midnightses. The medieval night deepened, and the flickering candlelight gave way to shadows on cold stone walls. People didn't just close their eyes and drift into nothingness. No, dreams held power. Sleep wasn't just rest, it was a mysterious journey where souls wandered and meanings whispered through the silence. In that world, dreams were messages from heaven, or perhaps from something darker, a dream of fire. Maybe it was a warning of hell's flame. A dream of water could mean cleansing, or an omen of drowning. Each image held weight, each symbol a signal. And so, people spoke of their dreams in the morning, like others spoke of the weather. They confessed them to priests. They fasted in response. Some even kept dream journals. Centuries before Freud was a thought, writers and monks wove dreams into poems and prayers, believing that in sleep, God might whisper a truth too fragile for the waking world. Sleeping with animals, not what you think now. Imagine this, you're in a one-room cottage. It's freezing. No insulation, no radiator, just straw and company. A dog lies at your feet. A few chickens scratch nearby. Maybe a pig sleeps just feet from the bed. Its warmth as good as any blanket. Welcome to medieval heating animals central. In peasant homes, sleeping with animals was neither weird nor wild. It was practical. Animals gave off warmth, warned of intruders, and were too valuable to leave outside in the cold, even in wealthier homes. Tiny lapdogs snuggled beneath covers not just for comfort, but as status symbols. Some noble pets even had their own beds, tended by servants. The midnight lives of monks far from farms and families. Behind monastery walls, monks lived by a different rhythm, one ruled by bells, devotion, and broken sleep. In long, cold dormitories, dozens of monks slept. Side by side, no pillows, no privacy, just silence. At 2 a.m., a bell would toll. Matins had begun, drowsy and obedient. They rose from their straw mattresses fully clothed, filing into the echoing chapel by candlelight. There, they chanted ancient prayers into the still air. It wasn't performance, it was discipline. Worship carved into the night itself. Some would return to sleep afterward, if time allowed. Others would go straight into daily labor. No complaints, no comfort, just devotion, alone in the dark. Dangerous in that age, sleeping alone was not romantic, it was strange, and sometimes even suspicious. To be alone at night meant your soul was unguarded. Evil thoughts or, worse, evil spirits could sneak in. That's why families, servants, even travelers shared beds. Togetherness meant protection. In monasteries, solitary sleep was often a punishment. For most, the idea of one person in one bed, in one room, was unnatural. It invited temptation, or melancholy, or worse, attention from spirits lurking just outside the veil. The sleep of the upright. Finally, let's talk posture. Some medieval people, especially among the devout or the sick, preferred to sleep sitting up. Why? Well, lying completely flat resembled death. It was said that evil could mistake you for a corpse and come to claim your soul. Others feared that sleeping flat caused poor digestion or let bad humors rise into the head, so they propped themselves upright, cloaked in wool, head wrapped in a nightcap, and dozed like statues, halfway between wakefulness and the dream. So the next time your sleep feels restless, chaotic, or strange, remember, in the Middle Ages, sleep wasn't a pause. It was a journey, a ritual, a glimpse into something deeper than dreams. In the medieval world, comfort was often a luxury when it came to sleep. While nobles might recline on angled supports, half sitting like regal statues, most people rested in positions less about relaxation and more about survival or virtue. For monks and the devout, sleep itself was treated with suspicion. Too much ease, they believed, could invite dreams, and dreams might tempt the soul toward sin. So they trained themselves to sleep upright on benches or stone walls, with only a hood to soften the chill, a spiritual discipline disguised as discomfort. But even for the less pious, the bed was rarely a sanctuary. It was a battleground. There, beneath the linens and straw-filled mattresses, lurked the real monsters of the night. Not goblins or ghouls, but tiny invaders, fleas, lice, and the ever-present bedbug. Hygiene was, at best, a suggestion in medieval life. Baths were rare. Soap was questionable, and shared bedding with strangers or livestock turned sleep into a nightly buffet for biting pests. Nobles, despite their feather beds and embroidered sheets, were not spared. In fact, some aristocratic households employed servants known solely for their skill at nitpicking. Literally, their role was to rid their master's hair and garments of lice. Imagine that as your job title. To ward off pests, people got creative. Beds were sprinkled with ashes or pungent herbs like wormwood and tansy. Garlic was tucked under pillows, not for vampires, but for vermin. Others simply accepted the scratching as part of bedtime, their only real defense, a nightcap and layers of clothing that served more as armor than pajamas. And speaking of armor, in times of war, even sleep could not be trusted. Some knights, camped in hostile territory, rested only partially disrobed, helmets and gauntlets removed, but chainmail or breastplates left unjust in case the enemy came calling before dawn. Swords lay within reach, shields became pillows, and dreams, if they came, were likely brief and restless. But the armor clanked, the stone floors were cold, and the torchlight flickered shadows that danced like ghostly reminders. You could be safe, or you could be asleep, but rarely both. And then there were the sleepwalkers. To modern minds, it's a curiosity, but to medieval hearts, it was terrifying. A person rising in the night, ties blank, steps slow, whispering words they didn't remember. This was not seen as a sleep disorder. It was seen as possession. Or worse, some claimed it was the soul leaving the body, wandering aimlessly while the flesh remained behind. Others believed the devil used sleep as a doorway to step in, Remedies ranged from the herbal to the absurd iron charms hung above beds, legs tied to chairs, or holy water sprinkled on pillows, anything to keep the unconscious from walking into the fire or the arms of temptation. And yet, somehow, they slept through storms and invasions, through lice and legends, through bells that tolled in the dark and dreams that walked, because in the Middle Ages, sleep wasn't an escape, it was endurance, but to speak in defense of an accused witch, that was to paint a silent target on your own back. Silence became safety. And so, the web of fear stretched wider, its threads invisible, yet inescapable, till the whole village seemed ensnared in something darker than nightfall, as whispers turned to weeping and reason slipped quietly out the back door. Hysteria took center stage. The colony could no longer ignore it, and so, in stepped the government. Governor William Phipps, newly appointed and eager to restore order, established a special court with a name borrowed from the French choyer and terminer, meaning to hear and determine. But what it became was something else entirely, not a court of law, but a machine of fear-churning judgment out of shadows and dreams. The court gathered in Salem town, June of 1692, and it followed rules whisted by panic and drenched in superstition. Gone was the need for evidence you could see or testimony you could trust. Instead, it welcomed something far more dangerous, spectral evidence, a dream, a vision, a ghostly image of someone harming you while they slept peacefully elsewhere. That was enough. If you said you'd seen a spirit choking you in your sleep, the court listened. You couldn't cross-examine a dream. You couldn't prove where your soul had not been, while us children, once dismissed for their wild imaginations, were now the star witnesses. Their fits grew louder, their gasps sharper. One girl, Mary Walcott, was said to collapse the moment an accused witch entered the room. If the prisoner looked at her, she screamed. If the prisoner did not look, she screamed louder. Each performance was more chilling than the last, and the judges, they believed it all. Among them sat Judge Samuel Sewell and whispers. To question the court was to question God himself, and so fear ruled, not justice. On June 10, 1692, the first rope tightened on Gallows Hill. The victim was Bridget Bishop. She wore bright red. She ran a tavern. She had long been a target for gossip, Old rumors returned of enchanted dolls, of babies who sickened when she passed by. She denied every word. Still, the court found her guilty. They led her to that barren hilltop, where wind moaned through the trees and the crowd stood still. There was no prayer, no final mercy, just the silence that comes after a rope snaps tight. And with her death, the wheel of executions began to turn. By July 19th, 5 more women had been hanged. Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Some of them had once been beloved, respected mothers, neighbors. Now they were just shadows hanging in the wind as Salem fell deeper into its long, dark sleep. As the church bells echoed across Salem, a hush fell over the room. Among the accused stood Rebecca Nursen, elderly, devout woman, beloved by nearly all who knew her. Her case sent shockwaves through the village. Even the jury, at first, had declared her not guilty. But the court pressed them, and the afflicted girls wailed with renewed conviction. Under pressure, the verdict was reversed. Her final words were whispered like a prayer lost to the wind. I am as innocent as the child unborn. But innocence offered no protection. The noose made no distinctions. And so she too was hanged. August brought more executions. And then came September 22nd, the deadliest morning of them all. 8 souls were taken in a single day. Among them was Martha Corey, who had once spoken against the trials, and her husband, Giles Corey, met a fate even crueler. He refused to enter, a bleaching silence as his defense. Without a confession, the court invoked an ancient punishment, pene forte et dura, pressing to death. Heavy stones were laid upon his chest, one after another, over the course of 3 long days. His last words, according to legend, were defiant and simple. More weight. By the time the hysteria waned, 19 people had been hanged. 1 man had been crushed to death. At least 5 had died in the squalid jails, waiting for a trial that never came. Dozens more confessed, falsely, just to survive. Over 200 souls were accused. The gallows loomed not only over the hill, but over every doorway in Salem, and in the shadows of the scaffold, life unraveled for those still waiting in silence. The town's tiny jail couldn't hold them all. Many were sent to neighboring cities, Ipswich, Boston, where they were chained to damp stone walls, cold, starved, forgotten. These weren't witches. They were mothers, fathers, friends, children, people whose only crime was a quarrel, a piece of land, or the envy of a neighbor. Sometimes the accusations were laughably. Pig died in a neighbor's yard, and someone must have bewitched it. A man refused to lend firewood. Surely a curse had soured his axe. But in Salem, fear dressed itself as justice. Mary Easty was one such victim, the sister of Rebecca Nurse. She was a respected woman, a mother of 7. Initially released, she was rearrested days later when the afflicted girls claimed new visions. This time, the court did not let her go. In her final petition, Mary didn't plead for her life. She asked only that the madness stop before more innocent blood was spilled. She was hanged soon after. Then came the story of little Dorothy Gugist. 4 years obscurity. One Ann Putnam Jr. would later stand before her church and apologize, blaming her actions on delusion and Satan. But no apology could undo what had been done. Even the judges carried the weight. Samuel Sewall, one of the most prominent, stood in church in 1697 and publicly asked for forgiveness. It was rare. Most chose silence. The families of the condemned demanded justice. Petitions were sent. In 1711, the colony passed a bill restoring some names and offering partial restitution. But many families were left out entirely. The whispers of witchcraft never fully left New England, but in Salem they were replaced by something heavier, guilt, and long after the noose was taken down, the shadows it cast remained, and so, in the flickering candlelight of the old wooden church, shadows stretched long across the floor as quiet prayers gave way to gasps. Among the most heart-wrenching names whispered through Salem's fearful air was that of Rebecca Nurse, a gentle, elderly woman known for her kindness and unwavering piety. Rebecca had been loved, not feared, when the jury first declared her not guilty. A fragile hope stirred, but that hope was quickly crushed, pressured by judges and the fearful cries of afflicted girls. The verdict was reversed. Rebecca's final words, whispered with the calm certainty of the innocent, drifted like mist. I am as innocent as the child unborn. But the noose did not listen, and the sky did not weep. In August, more followed her to the gallows, and came September 22nd, a day the village would never forget. 8 souls were taken in the hush of morning light. Among them was Martha Corey, a woman once skeptical of the trials, and her husband, Giles Corey, who refused to plead. Without a confession, the court turned to an ancient cruelty, pressing day by day. Stone by heavy stone, his chest bore the weight of injustice. For 3 long days, he endured in silence. And when asked for his final words, the legend tells us he whispered too, more weight. By the end, 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death. At least 5 more would perish in jail, their names lost in shadows. Over 200 souls were accused, and across the land, gallows stretched their arms over a frightened town. While the trials made headlines, hundreds sat in cold, dark jails, their names forgotten, their bellies empty. Salem's own jail was too small, and so the accused were scattered, held in distant towns, chained to stone walls, starving and shivering in the silence. Most were not witches, not even close. They were neighbors, friends, sons and mothers. Their only crime, owning land, saying the wrong thing, or having the wrong enemy. A pig wandering into a garden and dying became a death sentence. A refusal to share firewood became a curse. Even Mary Eastie's sister to the late Rebecca Nurse was not spared. A devoted mother of 7, she had once been freed only to be dragged back when new fits were performed. Before her death, Mary wrote a final plea, not to save herself, but to stop the trials before more innocent lives were taken. She was hanged soon after. And then there was Dorothy Good, just 4 years old. She was the daughter of the accused, Sarah Good. In fear, the little girl mumbled confused answers, and those frightened words were taken as truth. Dorothy was chained in a cell for 8 long months. When she was finally freed, she was no longer the same child. The world had taken too much from her. Even pregnant women were not spared. Elizabeth Proctor, whose husband John would later hang, was sentenced to, but her life was delayed by the life growing within her. She gave birth in a jail cell, and because of that small miracle, she survived. The fear fed itself to save their own lives. Some confessed, then named others, neighbors, friends, entire families. It was no longer about guilt or innocence, only about staying alive. By the fall of 1692, the fever began to break not from compassion, but from consequence. One morning, a familiar name was called. Reverend George Burroughs, once a respected minister in Salem. On the day of his execution, he stood atop the gallows and with calm clarity recited the Lord's Prayer, a thing which we're said to be unable to do. The crowd fell silent. Some wept, but still the rope was pulled. Then a final, impossible accusation. Mary Phipps, the wife of the governor himself. And just like that, the fire turned on those who had stoked it. Governor William Phipps, shaken and shamed, dissolved the court in October. No more hangings, no more trials. The wind had changed. Even the ministers who had once nodded in silence now spoke with regret. Increased Mather, a respected voice, finally said aloud what others had feared to whisper. It were better that 10 suspected witches escaped than that one innocent person be condemned. It was a truth that had come too late for many. The jails remained full, but the village's thirst for blood had dried. And with it, the spell of hysteria began to fade in the twilight of the Roman Republic as shadows deepened across the capital. Fulvia stepped forward not as a whisper behind power, but as its voice, while Antony joined forces with Octavian and Lepidus in the fragile triumvirate. It was Fulvia who held Rome's pulse in her hands. In the heart of the city, she managed patronage networks, coordinated with street gangs, and kept Antony's supporters both loyal and active. She was more than his wife. She was his proxy. She arranged a political marriage between her daughter, Clodia, and Octavian himself, an alliance that would unravel dramatically in time. Fulvia's influence wasn't cloaked, it was stamped in bronze literally. Coins were minted, bearing both Antony's image and her name, an audacious public recognition in a city that rarely named its women. She walked not behind power, but within its very center. But in Rome, power for a woman was always borrowed, always conditional, and Fulvia was about to find its limits. As Antony pursued conquests and alliances abroad, Fulvia ruled in his absence. In the streets of Rome, where bribes whispered louder than laws, and violence often settled debates, she played the political game with a shrewdness that matched any senator. She dealt with plebeians, negotiated with factions, and kept Antony's cause alive with silver and speeches. Some ancient voices, hostile, suspicious, often male-branded her as manipulative, warmongering. But behind those bitter labels lies something more truthful, a woman doing what no Roman woman had done. She was issuing orders, funding troops, and shaping policy not from the shadows, but in full daylight. Fulvia met with veteran soldiers, influenced land distributions, and made appearances to rally support. To many of Antony's legions, she was the command. but her rising prominence drew resentment. Octavian's allies, uneasy with her power, saw her as a threat, a woman unbound by guardianship, unrestrained by tradition. And they were right to feel threatened. Fulvia saw the fracture growing between Antony and Octavian. First and only time in Roman history, a woman ignited a civil war. This was her war. Even ancient writers, skeptical as they were, admit that Fulvia's fire burned brighter than Lucius. She rallied soldiers, stirred the Roman crowd, sent letters to generals. Some whispered she forced Lucius into battles he did not want, and Octavian, though stunned, responded swiftly. He besieged Perusia through the cold winter of 41 to 40 BCE, trapped by hunger, betrayal, and a tightening siege. Fulvia watched her could be born. Still, Fulvia had her loyalists. Some soldiers urged Antony to reconcile, but her health had faded. Siege, exile, betrayal. By late 40 BCE, Fulvia was gone, perhaps from illness, perhaps from grief, or perhaps from a heart too deeply wounded. She was only around 43 years old. Her death gave Antony the political clean slate he needed. He met with Octavian, and peace was renewed. But the cost of that peace was Fulvia. No funeral, no honor, just silence. Yet Fulvia would not be erased so easily. Her enemies tried. They blamed her for everything. her dangerous not just to men like Octavian, but to the very memory of Rome. Even Antony, the man she fought for, blamed her in the end. He married Octavian's sister, buried the past, and moved forward. Fulvia became a ghost in political memory. No statues were raised, no speeches given, no marble carved in her name, but she left something behind that couldn't be buried. She was the first Roman woman whose name appeared on coins, not as a goddess, but as a force in politics. She made war. She wielded power. And though Rome tried to silence her, her defiance still echoes if you're willing to listen closely. In the quiet corners of forgotten history, marched into it, but history, shaped by fearful men, didn't know what to do with her. They painted her as dangerous, disruptive because she dared to lead, and yet her shadow never left Rome. Women like Livia, Cleopatra, Agrippina, they all walked the path Fulvia carved first. She was not crowned, not celebrated, but she was the blueprint. And now, in quiet corners of libraries and the minds of modern historians, her story is being heard again, not as scandal, but as strength. As you drift toward dreams, let Fulvia's memory remind you, even if the world forgets, greatness leaves echoes, and as the stars settle over Rome's sleeping ruins, the dream shifts, another march begins, not with swords, but with steps. The year is 1963, and a different kind of revolution is about to begin. As the summer sun dipped behind the Washington Monument, a sea of souls stood still. Over 250,000 people, young and old, black and white, gathered beneath the shadow of Lincoln, holding signs, wiping tears, and hoping the world was finally listening. And then, a voice rose from behind Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Gospel singer Mahalia Jackson called out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." He paused, then set his notes aside, and with a calm, thunderous grace, he began, "I have a dream." The crowd leaned in, each word a prayer, each phrase a promise. A dream that one day children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but as perfect as it looked, was held together by tension, last-minute changes, and courage. By our Rustin, the man behind the scenes, juggled logistics while battling prejudice for being black, gay, and politically suspect. Women like Rosa Parks and Ella Baker were honored but not handed microphones, even within a movement for justice. Equality was still unfolding, and yet they stood as one. Even the government watched, anxious and wary. FBI agents tapped phones, followed organizers, and filed thick folders of